Welcome, Dr. Epic here. And what we're going to do in this lecture is we're going to talk about ideas. We're going to talk about 18th century political philosophy. We're going to talk about the legitimacy of violence, natural rights of humans, mad kings, and American preachers. And all of this is answering this sort of philosophical question, this big question, which is why have a government at all? Why do we have a government? And there's the table of contents up above me. I highly recommend writing that down so it serves as a sort of an index. It serves as a guide for your notes that are out to follow. And let's go ahead and begin. So we're answering this question. Why do we have a government? Why do we give these elected representatives, why do we give these people money? Why do we give these people power? Why do we give them big black Escalades and big fancy buildings to work in? Why do we have a government at all? So what I want you to do in your notes right now is to kind of pause the lecture, think about this for a second, and write down 3 reasons why we actually have a government. Number 1, write it out. Number 2, write it out. Number 3, write it out. Why do we actually have a government? Go ahead and do that. I mean, I'm not going anywhere. I'm trapped in a little yellow box with my coffee. Go ahead and write that down. I'm right here. Got it? Good. Let's keep going. Before we have to talk about political philosophies, we have to talk about the nature of humanity. What is the nature of man? Stripped of government, alone in the wilderness, how would people behave? And I'm asking this question because generally your opinion of your fellow human being largely determines your politics. Generally, one's view on human nature strongly influences one's politics, one's political philosophy, and ergo, your view of government. If you think very badly of fellow people, if you think generally fellow people act quite poorly, you're going to have an opinion about one kind of government. If you think that people are generally good, you're going to have an opinion of another kind of government. But you know what? Let's actually make that a multiple choice question. Here we have, right up above, a multiple choice question. What I want you to do is to read these 4 and write down, don't just put A, B, C, or D, write down the full thing of what you think is the basic nature of your fellow humans. What is the nature of man? A, humans are naturally selfish and evil. Good requires effort. People are made moral by the power of government and the fear of that governmental power. That's option A. Let's try option B. Humans are inherently altruistic and good. There we go, the guy in the corner. He's good. He's holding an umbrella for a guy in a wheelchair. Anyway, B, humans are inherently altruistic and good, but perverted to evil through cruelty and mischance. People are born good, but then they are corrupted by society. C, humans are born equal and free, but they are diminished and constrained by each other. Government exists to protect people and property from each other. People and their property from each other. That's the point of government. Or D, humans are selfish, but not necessarily evil. Government exists to protect people from each other, but people will use the government to rob and steal from each other selfishly. You know, if they give them power, the power will corrupt them. So there we go. What is your nature? What is your opinion of the nature of man? A, B, C, or D? Write it down because we're going to consult back with it in a bit. This is good coffee. Finally, as we reach the end of our philosophic quiz, we're going to talk about the nature of political violence. Are political riots wrong? Getting together with you and a bunch of your friends and people of similar political interests, fighting police and wrecking up the place. Is political violence always wrong? Yes or no? Write down that question and your answer. Is political violence ever justified? Yes or no? Is it okay if you're really, really upset at the governor to go burn his house down? It's happened. And if you do believe that political violence is justified, what justifies rising up and fighting the government? If you don't believe that political violence is ever justified, are there any circumstances that would change your mind? Are there any circumstances you could conceive of that justify political violence? Write down your answers in your notebook, because as we get into Mad Kings and American preachers and Thomas Hobbes and John Locke and Baron Montesquieu and all these guys, we're going to refer back to your opinions. And I'm especially interested if any of these opinions change by the end of our discussion of everyone's favorite topic, 18th century political philosophy. So, okay, we're going to go back in time. 1787. George Washington, they're building the Constitution. They're building the American government. What was their point? What was their goal? Well, their goal was something that was really quite remarkable. A functional, long-term, prosperous, stable democracy. And, we sort of say, oh, well, these guys in, funny silk coat and breeches and hose and powdered wigs. These guys, it's very abstracted for me. It's very abstracted from 21st century life. But my question is it? Is it really? I mean, we say these things, well, of course these guys wanted functional, long-term, prosperous, stable democracies. But you have to understand a couple things. One, in the 18th century, in 1787, there were no functional, long-term, prosperous, stable democracies. There weren't any. The world was comprised of monarchs, emperors, dictators, and a handful of tiny republics that were either on the verge of collapse or just about to collapse. Until the United States comes along, there has never been a functional, long-term, prosperous, and stable economy. There's been stable democracies, there have been functional democracies, but not ones that are long-term, prosperous, or stable, even in the classic world. And we'll talk about reasons for that. That's the problem, is how you actually build a democracy with all four of these things. And the founding fathers of the United States addressed that question. They attempted to answer that question. And they succeeded. And this is really the genius of the founding fathers. And this is the genius that comes out of these political philosophies in action, is the formation of our current government. And the reason why our government has been so stable and so successful, for, almost 200 years, And, you think about that. Ever since 1787, we've had the same government, the U.S. Constitution. Almost no countries in the world can say that. I mean, England comes close, but England's constitution, its unwritten constitution, has been changed so many times, it's unrecognizable. And look at France. Since 1787, France has had, goodness, a kingdom, a republic, an empire, a kingdom, a third kingdom, another republic, a second empire, and then 3 more republics. Since 1787, France has had 10 different governments. The United States has had 1. That's France. That's, the less we talk about Germany, the better. It's German history, good Lord. Okay. Now, the actual question. Let's take that big question and break it into a bunch of little questions. And that way we can answer it piecemeal and we don't have to tackle one huge question all in one big bite. And there's the question right up above me. And this is the question we're going to answer together over the course of this lecture. And I highly recommend you write it down. And as we move through this lecture, keep it percolating in the back of your brain. And the question is, why have a government? Explain the Enlightenment reasoning for a government. What are these political philosophies and how do they appear in the 6 main documents of the American founding. 6. What did James Madison write about the reasons for government? And importantly, what parts of these political philosophies do the American founders change? Because they espouse these ideas, but then they don't necessarily do what they say. Why does any of this matter? Why does any of this matter? This matters because a government should be able to justify its existence. And that justification should include both the powers it has and the limits on those powers. And exactly what those powers are affects our daily lives. And it affects our daily lives, well, you can see from these news stories around me. All of these are arguments about political plans or laws or quotas that may or may not be permissible given the limits we have placed on our government. Is it acceptable for California to pass a law saying you must have X number of male or female employees? Should a government have the power to take people's wealth, not just their income, but their wealth? Does the government have the power to restrict firearms and ownership of guns? And if they disagree, are local law enforcement beholden to obey a law that they don't think is just or constitutional? Do you have the right to say anything you want? Or do certain local governments, and in this case the University of Illinois, do they have the power to create and enforce speech codes? Can the president unilaterally grant citizenship to non-citizens, or does it require a law? Does he have that power? This is why it matters, because all of these limitations, all of the powers of government, as well as the limitations on that power, they all go back to these 18th century debates about the reasons to have a government. Why is the government built the way it is? And why are these limits placed on it? There's a reason the founding fathers placed those limits. You have these images of the founding fathers, these sort of old white men with their powdered wigs and their silken coats and their breeches and their hose and their shoes with the little buckles on it. And you have the image of these guys just sort of leisurely sitting around a room or a salon and sipping their little cup of tea and talking about these hypothetical government structures and how it's supposed to work in theory and how I would do it and how you would do it. And that's the images that these paintings give, but that's not really the time that these guys lived in. These guys did not live in peaceful, untroubled times. As a matter of fact, the 50 years between 1750 and 1800, these are very tumultuous 50 years, an incredibly tumultuous 50 years. Outside of the Civil War, no generation experienced more violence and upheaval and disruption, revolution after revolution, sweeping what were the American colonies and then became the United States in a single 50-year period. And here I've built a rough timeline of exactly how tumultuous these times were. You have two major wars, 1754 to 1763, the French and Indian War, a major war. 1770, you have the Boston Massacre, where the British Army guns down people on the streets of Boston. 1773, you have the Boston Tea Party, where the Sons of Liberty, we'll get to those guys in a bit, the Sons of Liberty storm aboard these ships and throw their cargoes into the bay. And this all results in the second major war of the period, 1775 to 1783, the American Revolution itself, the Revolutionary War. But of course, we're only halfway through this timeline. What happens in the 1780s is a complete collapse of the American currency and a profound economic meltdown in America, Following the Revolutionary War, everything was just a wreck. But the long drawn-out treaty to separate ourselves from Great Britain occurs in 1783, Treaty of Paris. Creates the United States of America. But it's not a very united state. For 20 years, 1771 to 1791, Vermont, what is now the state of Vermont, Vermont was its own country. It attempted to create its own country. It wanted to be the Vermont Republic. Actually asked to join Canada at one point. But yeah, Vermont wants to be its own country. The currency's melted down. We've just finished the Revolutionary War. And then we're faced with all of these rebellions in the countryside. 1786 to 1787. Daniel Shay's rebellion in western Massachusetts almost takes down the state government. And this shows the need for a unified new government. And that's when we have the Philadelphia Convention, 1787, 1788, the U.S. Constitution, and the election of the very first president. I mean, there's a gap of about 5 years between the end of the Revolutionary War and the U.S. Constitution. And we're not even at the end yet. You have another big rebellion in western Pennsylvania that lasts 3 years, 1791 to 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion. These are very, very tumultuous times. These are times where people are getting beaten up. They're being thrown into rivers. There are urban riots. There's riots in the countryside. They are manhandling people, dragging them underneath liberty trees and pouring burning tea into their mouths after being tarred and feathered. They roll them in hot tar and then throw chicken feathers on them and literally ride them out of town on a rail. And this isn't even mentioning the two major wars. The war between the English colonies, the British Empire and the French Empire, French and Indian War, followed by the American Revolution itself, fighting, the largest army, in which the American colonies fight the largest army in the world, the British Army. And the crazy thing is these people succeeded. For all of their powdered wigs and, shoes with buckles on them, for all of their, kind of what it seems to us very dandified manners, they largely succeeded. When these guys are arguing these political philosophies, when these guys are organizing the political mechanisms that are going to create the U.S. Constitution, they're living with a real threat of physical violence. They're living with a real threat, of being accused as traitors, of being captured, executed by the British. But they succeed. That's the crazy thing, is they actually succeed. By 1800, a lot of these political issues had been resolved and a new country had been created. There's the map of the country. There's the United States in 1800. George Washington is president. John Adams is stepping down. 1800, the third president is on his way to Washington, Thomas Jefferson. They succeeded. They took these fractious colonies and turned them into states. They even got Vermont to rejoin. That was pretty impressive. So what we're going to do is we're going to play a giant game of matching. We've got these 18th century political philosophers that we're going to talk about, and these political philosophies that we're going to talk about. And we're going to match these with the founding documents of the United States. Now, for the purpose of this lecture, I've boiled down the founding documents of the United States into basically 6 documents. And yeah, I had to make some hard calls. I apologize, Mayflower Compact. You didn't make it in. At any rate, we've got the 6 founding documents of the United States right up above. The English Bill of Rights, Common Sense, the Declaration of Independence, the Federalist Papers, the U.S. Constitution, and the U.S. Bill of Rights. And there they are on the left. And what we're going to do, and what I want you to do, is to look at how these political philosophies manifest themselves in these 6 documents, and what part of these political philosophies that they conveniently ignore. But not all of these documents are equal. Clearly, 2 of them are far more important than any others. The Declaration of Independence there on the left, and the U.S. Constitution right up above me. Now, these 2 documents, even though they're written, years and years, they're written, 12 years apart. Oh no, ratified, they're written 15 years apart. The 2 documents do go together. the Declaration of Independence is a statement of political protest. It is a statement of political ideology. But the U.S. Constitution is how to governmentally manifest that political philosophy. So the two documents work together. The Declaration works as sort of a theoretical introduction, and the Constitution acts as a political methodology to manifest that political philosophy. All right, let's go to 1750. 1750. America is a series of 12 colonies. Delaware's not a colony yet. Each with its own colonial government, with an ill-defined relationship with the government back in Britain. Each of these colonies has its own royal charter and is given its own different set of powers and a different relationship with the monarchy back in England, back in Britain. It's the Kingdom of England, but it's the United Kingdom after 1707. And each colony has a different charter, and each colony has a slightly different form of government. And in addition, there's a number of laws, like the Navigation Acts, in which the Americans are only supposed to trade with the British. But the problem with things like the Navigation Act is that you have all these laws on the books that nobody ever really enforced. So, and that's a good political question right there. If a law exists but nobody follows it, does that law really exist? That's a good question. Now, England organizes itself in 1707 into the United Kingdom of England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And in the United Kingdom in 1707 is itself kind of this poorly defined identity. Even today, the United Kingdom has no written constitution. They have an informal constitution based on laws and precedents. And they've got a parliament and a king, and the parliament and the king both have different sets of powers, and custom kind of rules the day. It's never formally defined. The relationship between parliament and king is never formally defined. The relationship between the home country and the colonies is never formally defined. And you have a lot of laws that everyone just kind of ignores. And ultimately, you have a series of unresolved questions. And these questions are, where does the king actually get his authority? Why should we listen to this guy who is the king of the United Kingdom? And what actually makes you eligible to be king? How does somebody become a king? Who gets to be king? These are the questions that are undefined, all right? Now, the old idea from the Middle Ages, this is why the king is chosen. This is why the king gets his authority. The king gets his authority from God, the man upstairs, okay? There we have, I think that's one of the Charles, the kings of France. You can literally see an angel holding a grass crown over his head. This is the divine right of kings. It's the political theory that the ruling family and the king himself or herself had been chosen by God. God chose that person to be king. He chose that family to rule. And this sometimes works through the intermediacy of the papacy. God tells the Pope, and then the Pope says what God's will is. That's the family that's going to be king. So if the king derives his authority from God, then the role of the king, the job of the king, is to execute the will of God. He is to defend the faith and to protect the faithful. That's why the king gets his authority. That's why the king is chosen. Now, the divine right of kings is actually formally codified in this book by Sir Robert Filmer. And it's not actually that good of a book, but it does sort of give why kings have a natural right to rule, why they are sanctified by the Almighty to rule this nation, or to rule that nation. And Filmer's ideas himself are not actually that great, but it's the response to Filmer that is going to create one of the greatest political documents of all time. And we'll find that one. We'll come meet that document in just a tick. Now, the divine right of kings starts to run into problems. And all of this starts to come to an end with the events of the 17th century. And what you have in this period is, of course, the English Civil War that we've already previously discussed, the war between the king and his cavaliers and between Parliament and the Puritans. And of course, that ends in the victory of Parliament. And over the course of the 17th century, you have the English Parliament, during the Civil War, it deposed and executes one king, Charles I. It restores the monarchy with his son, Charles II. That's the Merry Monarch. That's Good Time Charlie that we've talked about. And then he dies without children, and his brother becomes king. He is then deposed. That's James II. Then it selects a Dutch nobleman to be king, and that guy becomes William III of Orange. And he dies childless. So then the Parliament selects his English sister-in-law. That's Queen Anne. And then poor Queen Anne doesn't have any children. And they eventually settle on her second cousin in Germany, a guy who will become known as King George I. And that's him up above. All of this is historical fact, and God's got nothing to do with it. God is not picking the kings of England and the kings of the United Kingdom. The English Parliament is picking these royals. Clearly, God is not selecting kings. George I actually had to go to several meetings in which they judged his fitness to be monarch. He kind of had to prove to the English that he was good enough to be their king, because he was German. Even though he apparently didn't speak English very well, he became King of England. And yeah, he kind of had to go to a job interview. I mean, not formally, but they set certain rules about him, and he had to meet them. But he got to be king. Now, George I, that's the line of kings that continues all the way to the 21st century. The current monarch, the current Queen of England, and eventually her successor, they are all descended from George I. So if you argue that God is selecting the king, you can quite easily look at what's going on in England in the 17th century. That's not God selecting king. It's the English Parliament. And the English Parliament is picked by, voters. And in addition to, it's clearly the Parliament that's picking the kings in England. Over time, some of these kings, there's something really wrong with some of these kings. And what happens is that generations of inbreeding was producing entire generations of mentally incompetent, mentally and physically disabled monarchs. And they're inbreeding because they want to keep the royal circle small. They want to cut down on people who can pretend to the throne, and to keep the power and authority close to the same set of people. So over and over and over, they're marrying cousins, they're marrying nieces, they're marrying their second or third cousin, and they do this for generations. And the problem is, if you do that for too long, you end up with people with major problems. And this was, of course, becoming evident in the 17th century and into the 18th century. You had monarchs that were, weaklings, incompetent. There's poor Queen Maria of Portugal. She's mad. She was epileptic. She was prone to these seizures and constant migraines. She claimed that God spoke to her. She would go into fits. She was just insane. Then you have on the upper left, you've got, poor Philip IV of Spain. He was, he was an idiot. And I don't mean that in the pejorative sense. I mean that in the descriptive sense. He was a simpleton. He probably had an IQ of around 60 or 70. He was mentally disabled. He would just stare off into space. He wouldn't understand what people were telling him. He played virtually no real role in the function of government. He just sort of stood there and let other people run the Kingdom of Spain. He did like art. So he liked He liked pretty pictures. Oh, here's poor Ferdinand I of Austria. That's not the artist's choice. His head was really like that. He had this weird hydrocephalic head. He was mentally retarded. When his nurses and caretakers would ask too much of him, he would go hide in trash cans. He would throw fits when apricots weren't in season. And that brings us to poor, oh good God, poor Charles II of Spain. El Hechizado, the bewitched. Charles II of Spain, he's the son of the simpleton in the upper left corner. His lower teeth were a full inch in front of his upper teeth. He was mentally retarded. He drooled. He would go into fits. He never really learned to read and write. He was mentally incontinent. A profoundly disabled person, all produced through generations of royal inbreeding. His parents were not only uncle and niece, they were also first and second cousins. Profoundly retarded person. This is God's choice? This is God's choice? That's what the big man is picking to rule our nation? A guy who can't even speak properly? A guy who hides in trash cans if he hears loud noises? Divine right of kings. No. God is clearly not choosing these people to be king. Now, the English, and after 1707, the British, the monarchs are actually being selected after lengthy public debate in Parliament. They pass a law, the Succession Act, which says exactly what it takes to be king. You can't be Catholic. You have to be descended from, I think, the Electress Sophia, if I'm not screwing that up. I think I screwed that up. Anyway, so the monarchs are being picked by Parliament. Well, and who picks who goes into Parliament? Well, Parliament is a council of people that's made up of a combination of both elected and inherited positions that are supposed to represent the British people. Okay, so God is not picking the king. God didn't pick George I. Parliament picked George I. So if the people are picking the king, then what is the king supposed to do? Is he supposed to defend the faith, obey the dictates of God? But he's not being picked by God. So what is the king supposed to do? Without a divine mandate, where does the authority of the monarch come from? And what is he or she supposed to do with that authority? What is the point of government? And indeed, a really dangerous idea that starts getting floated around is, do we really need a king at all? Now, all of this is taking place during something called the Age of Enlightenment, which is a period roughly between 1687 and 1800. What was the Age of Enlightenment? The Age of Enlightenment was a period of scientific and artistic triumph. People believed that all of the problems and all of the mysteries of the world could be solved through the application of reason. That regardless of the problem, artistic, mathematic, scientific, biological, all of these problems of the world can be solved by just sitting down and thinking about it hard enough. There's a particularly difficult math problem. René Descartes sits and thinks about it and comes up with Cartesian geometry. That's him in the center. There are certain laws concerning gravity and physics. All you have to do is sit and think about it long enough. And then you got Sir Isaac Newton there up on the left. When he comes up with the laws of Newtonian physics. So the Age of Enlightenment involved dozens of these people. Scientists, philosophers, artists, musicians, mathematicians, Sir Isaac Newton, René Descartes, Immanuel Kant, James Watt, Anton Lavoisier, and many, many more. I'm just mentioning some of them. But what they had in common was this idea that any problem can be solved by the application of reason. That's reason with a capital R. reason. And the thinkers of this age saw the collapse of the divine right of kings, saw this idea as a political problem. Well, it's the Age of Enlightenment, so how do you solve a political problem? Through the application of reason. And that's where these philosophies come from that we're going to talk about. Now, these guys are in Europe. Immanuel Kant's in Germany, René Descartes in France, Anton Lavoisier's in France, Isaac Newton is in England. We've got our own Enlightenment philosopher, the great American philosopher, Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin himself. Now, Benjamin Franklin is a major theory of the Age of the Enlightenment. He gets short shrift today because he got wrapped up in the political issues of his day. But he was interested in these things. He was one of the early experimenters with electricity. He really did fly a kite during a thunderstorm, thus proving that lightning is made up of electricity. Benjamin Franklin. You know, he invented the Franklin stove. He invented the lightning rod. He organized the postal service. He invented the first American fire department. Invented bifocals. I wear bifocals. Benjamin Franklin, the great American thinker of the Age of Enlightenment. He lived in Philadelphia, and he's called the first American. And he's actually one of the first people that notes that America is developing a different accent from England. Benjamin Franklin is one of the first people that notices this, that the American accent is becoming very distinct. Americans no longer sound like the English. He is primarily a publisher, and he publishes a series of newspapers, his most famous being Poor Richard's Almanac there on the left. And the thing about Benjamin Franklin is that Benjamin Franklin was clearly the most famous American of the 18th century. He was the first really big American celebrity. Everyone knows where Franklin is, and Franklin is present during this entire tumultuous period. He's present, he's on the Committee of Five that writes the Declaration of Independence. He's at the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. He's present during the American Civil War. He's present throughout all of this, and he is the most famous American of this period. And that's why we honor him. We almost had a state named Franklin. In fact, there was a state named Franklin. It didn't exist for very long. Today, it's the eastern part of Tennessee. But Franklin is present during this entire time. And Franklin is directly interjecting ideas from the Age of Enlightenment into the writing of the American documents, into these founding documents of the United States. Also taking place during this period are a great deal of religious change. And the Age of Enlightenment is changing religion. And specifically, it's changing American religion. And the Age of Enlightenment manifests itself religiously in two main ways. Through this new type of religion, a new sort of religious philosophy called Deism, and in the First Great Awakening. So what was Deism? Deism is sort of emphasized by that painting on the lower left. Deism is the religious idea of God as a clockmaker. You know, deism is a religious philosophy that says that the creator of the universe was a clockmaker, that he created the universe and he created the planets created a clock, this perfectly balanced, perfectly mechanized thing, and then set it into operation. And in a deistic view, God does not directly intervene in the workings of his creation. He might tweak a thing here or a thing there, but deists didn't actually pray, for instance, because there was no point. They worshipped God through the exploration of his mechanisms, by worshiping how the creator put this clockwork creation together. Like, Franklin was a deist. Thomas Jefferson was a deist. Thomas Jefferson, takes a version of the Bible and he edits it. He edits out all the miracles. He basically wants to turn it into a deistic philosophy that's stripped of superstition and magic. That's deism. And that influences these guys a lot. So in the American founding documents, you mentioned that, you can see that they mention the creator quite a bit, but the creator they're mentioning is not this sort of angry God of old Israel or the sort of evangelical faith in, Jesus Christ, the God that they're generally referencing is the deist God. God as a clockmaker who created the universe, set it into motion, but generally does not intervene in the workings of creation. This is contrasted with the second impact of the Age of Enlightenment on American religion, the First Great Awakening, and you can see that right up above me. The First Great Awakening kind of reached its fever pitch in the 1730s and 1740s. And basically it was a revival of the Christian faith in America. It followed the collapse of the old Puritan church in New England. And there is a modern historical debate about whether the First Great Awakening was a rejection of Enlightenment ideas. That's the approach that David Shai gives in the textbook, or whether it is a manifestation of these Enlightenment ideas. I am in the second school. I believe that what the First Great Awakening was to take certain ideas from the Age of Enlightenment, the use of reason, and to work out using holy text and using revealed faith, what is the relationship between the Creator and the individual. This is something quite different from previous religious philosophies in the United States, where the relationship was seen between the Almighty and not the individual, but the community. But in the First Great Awakening, it is clearly shown that each person, and they preach this in these sort of fiery sermons, each person has a close and intimate relationship with God, the man upstairs. And to reach salvation, you have to nurture and strengthen the personal relationship one has with God. And God gives you these natural rights and expects you to exercise them in building this religion. And this is important because when we get to the American Revolution itself, one of the things you'll find is that, yeah, we're going to talk about John Locke and Thomas Hobbes and the Baron Montesquieu and all these guys. But your average ordinary American is not sitting, in a coffee shop in New York and reading the Baron de Montesquieu. No, they're going to their local preacher. They're going to their local pastor. And their local pastor is giving them Enlightenment ideas. God gave you these natural rights. And the king is attempting to strip you of these God-given rights. Most of the ideals of the American Revolution are disseminated, not so much by pamphlets and newspapers, but by church pulpits. It is preachers who are instrumental in spreading the ideas of the American Revolution. And that brings us to the end of this portion of the lecture. What we're going to talk about next time is we're going to dig deep into the meat of these political philosophies themselves, and I will see you there.